Invisible scars, the price of women's survival in war. War leaves ruins that can be photographed, documented, and remembered in stone. Broken buildings, collapsed bridges, mass graves, those scars are visible to all. But the deepest scars are the ones no camera ever captures, no historian ever records, no monument ever honors. They are carved into women who survived, though survival itself came at a cost so heavy that their bodies and spirits never stopped paying. These are the invisible scars, the price of women's survival in war. The world often expects survivors to be celebrated as symbols of resilience, but it rarely asks what that resilience cost. For women, survival demanded silence, demanded sacrifice, demanded an erasure of self so complete that even decades later their laughter carried hesitation, their touch carried tremors, their eyes carried shadows. To survive was not to live freely. It was to walk through life carrying ruins inside the skin, ruins that no rebuilding could ever erase. I remember my grandmother telling me, "The war ended outside, but it never ended inside me." Her words carried weight that no one around her wanted to face. People preferred to point to Reconstruction, to peace treaties, to the supposed healing of nations. But inside her chest was a battlefield still echoing with explosions, still burning with fire, still soaked in blood. The scar was not on her skin, but in her breath. Every inhale carrying smoke, every exhale carrying silence. Invisible scars take many forms. Some are the scars of hunger, when women starved themselves to feed children, their bodies thinning until bones pressed against skin. Some are the scars of shame, when violence was inflicted upon them and silence forced upon them afterward. Some are the scars of vigilance, when sleep was no longer rest but another front of war, dreams haunted by flames and footsteps. And some are the scars of grief, where names of the dead repeated endlessly inside their heads like prayers they dared not forget. One woman once said, "I survived, but I died inside the day they took my sister." That is the paradox of invisible scars. The body continues, but the spirit fractures. People see survival and call it strength. But strength is often just another name for wounds too deep to heal. The truth no one tells is that women's survival was not just endurance. It was negotiation. They negotiated with silence, swallowing words that would have condemned them. They negotiated with their bodies, giving away pieces of dignity to protect their children. They negotiated with memory, deciding what to bury in order to keep walking. And every negotiation left marks unseen by outsiders, but felt every second by the women who bore them. I once found a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were never sent. My grandmother had written them during the war, letters addressed to no one in particular, sometimes to God, sometimes to her lost brothers, sometimes to the future. In one she wrote, "If anyone ever reads this, know that survival is not victory. It is debt." That line struck me like lightning. For her, living on meant carrying a burden that could never be paid back. That was her scar. Survival as lifelong guilt. Invisible scars also lived in the body itself. Women carried infections untreated, wounds that never closed properly, sicknesses born from hunger and cold. Doctors decades later called them illnesses of age, but the women knew better. They called them remains of war. Every cough was smoke returning. Every ache was a march repeated. Every scar inside the womb was memory of a birth that happened in shadows, in silence, sometimes followed by a grave too small. And yet, these women were called resilient. They were called strong. People marveled at their ability to keep families together, to rebuild communities, to raise children while carrying ruins in their chests. But no one asked what strength really felt like from the inside. No one asked if they wanted to be strong. The invisible scar of survival was precisely this, being celebrated for what destroyed them. I remember asking my mother why my grandmother never celebrated birthdays. She answered, because she felt it was wrong to celebrate life when so many had none. That was her scar, the inability to allow joy to exist without guilt. Invisible, but crushing. The war ended and decades passed, but invisible scars were passed on like inheritance. Children of these women grew up in homes where silence was louder than words, where fear lived in glances, where scarcity was taught even when food filled the shelves. Trauma became legacy. Grandchildren carried anxiety they could not explain, vigilance they had never learned directly, grief they never lived. Invisible scars became generational, seeping through bloodlines like unspoken curses. The ashes of these memories remind us that survival is not neutral. It has a cost, and women paid it with their bodies, their silences, their dreams, their futures. They bore invisible scars that history never counted, but that defined every breath they took. The truth no one tells about women in war is this: to survive is to be rewritten. And every rewriting leaves marks, not on skin, not on buildings, not on maps, but deep inside where no one can see. Those are the scars that outlive wars, the scars that remain even when nations heal, the scars that shape entire generations in silence. And so, the first truth of this story is revealed. Women survived, but survival itself was another battlefield. Their scars may be invisible, but they are eternal. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that their bodies became battlefields long before treaties were signed or borders redrawn. Flesh was treated as territory, conquered, occupied, violated, or used as shield. No map records this geography of pain. No archive lists the number of bodies turned into silent front lines. Yet every woman who survived carries the mark of that invasion, whether visible or hidden. When armies marched through villages, they seized more than food, more than land, more than homes. They seized bodies. The violation was not random. It was calculated, deliberate, a weapon of war meant to terrorize, to humiliate, to fracture communities. For every woman marked in this way, an entire family was broken. For every family broken, an entire village fell silent. The body became the most intimate battlefield, its scars more enduring than bomb craters. I remember my grandmother once lowering her voice when speaking of the war. She said, "They destroyed more than walls. They destroyed us inside." She never described details. She never needed to. The silence itself revealed what words could not. Her scar was not just memory. It was the way she carried her body afterward, never fully belonging to herself again. The truth they don't tell is that women bore the burden of survival in flesh. They starved so their children could eat. They carried babies while running through forests, their wombs exhausted yet still forced to sustain life. They walked barefoot through snow until their feet split open, their skin freezing, their bones aching, their bodies sacrificing piece by piece just to keep moving. Every act of endurance was inscribed on the body as scar. I once read about a woman who carried her paralyzed daughter on her back across mountains to escape soldiers. Her spine bent, her lungs collapsed in exhaustion, but she kept going. When asked years later how she managed, she answered, "It wasn't strength, it was desperation." Her scar was permanent pain in her body, but also the knowledge that love had forced her to become more than human. The truth they don't tell is that even pregnancies were caught in the fire of war. Women gave birth in barns, in fields, in cellars with bombs above. They cut umbilical cords with knives not cleaned, wiped newborns with rags, prayed that cries would not betray their hiding places. Some babies lived. Many did not. Mothers carried those deaths in their wombs long after, scars invisible to outsiders, but seared into their sense of self. I remember my mother telling me that when her neighbor gave birth in the middle of winter, the baby did not survive the night. They buried him beneath snow before dawn, so soldiers would not find them. She whispered, "The ground held more infants than cradles." That truth alone was scar enough. The body as territory was not always violation through force. Sometimes it was exhaustion, forced labor, endless walking. Women's hands blistered from carrying water, their backs bent from lifting stones, their arms bruised from carrying children too heavy for starving muscles. Their bodies became tools of survival, and survival consumed them. The truth they don't tell is that long after the war ended, the body remembered. Women carried arthritis from marches, weak lungs from smoke, infections untreated because no doctors remained. They limped through peace with bones that cracked like old wood, spines curved by burdens no one else saw. Their bodies were archives of war, but no one read them. I once met an old woman who flinched every time someone touched her arm. She had no visible scars, but she recoiled as though burned. When asked why, she whispered, "Because my body does not forget." That was the scar of territory, flesh that remained battlefield long after the soldiers were gone. The ashes in their flesh remind us that war does not only destroy landscapes. It invades bodies, carving maps no one acknowledges. Women bore this scar in silence, in pain, in the way their skin remembered violence even when their voices refused to speak. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that survival was written not only in stories, but in skin, in bones, in wombs. Their bodies were forced to carry what nations erased. They became territories of conquest, archives of endurance, battlegrounds of memory. And though invisible to history, those scars remain, eternal as the flesh that bore them. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that silence was both salvation and suffocation. In silence, lives were spared. In silence, families endured. But silence also became a prison, locking inside screams, confessions, and grief too heavy to remain unspoken. For women, silence was not absence. It was presence, a force that wrapped itself around them like a shroud, a language carved into bone, a companion that never left. When soldiers entered villages, silence was the first weapon. Mothers pressed hands against children's mouths, rocked them without song, trained them to breathe quietly. A single cry could bring death. A single word could betray hiding places. Women became guardians of silence, teaching survival through quiet discipline. Their scar was not just in keeping still, but in learning that sound itself had become dangerous. I remember my grandmother telling me how, during a raid, she smothered her baby's cry against her chest. "I thought I would kill him with silence," she whispered. The baby lived, but her memory of that moment never left. Her scar was the guilt of nearly suffocating love in order to protect it. The truth they don't tell is that silence was trained into the body. Women taught children to play games without noise, to cough into rags, to move barefoot across broken wood. They rehearsed silence until it became instinct. Laughter was swallowed. Songs were muted. Stories were buried. Childhood itself was silenced. The scar lived in generations who grew up with voices locked inside their throats, who learned that speaking was betrayal. I once read about a girl who didn't speak until she was 6. Not because she couldn't, but because she had been taught that silence was safety. When peace finally came, her first words were whispered, hesitant, as though air itself might punish her. Her scar was not only delayed speech, but a life shaped by fear of her own voice. The truth they don't tell is that silence connected women to one another as much as it isolated them. A glance, a nod, a tightening of the lips could communicate warnings or grief. They built entire languages without words, bonds forged in quiet understanding. Yet those same silences became walls. Secrets unspoken, pain unshared, memories trapped inside. The scar was dual: intimacy without voice, loneliness without escape. I remember my mother saying she could hear her neighbor's thoughts in the way she shut her shutters. Silence was full of meaning. Every small act carried weight. But years later, my mother confessed that silence had also stolen her ability to confide. "Even when I was safe, I still could not speak," she said. That was the scar silence left: mistrust of one's own voice. The truth they don't tell is that silence was forced not only by fear of soldiers, but by shame. Women violated, humiliated, broken. They carried their pain in quiet because the world did not want to hear. Communities whispered rumors, judged, condemned. Silence became another weapon used against them, sealing their wounds inside prisons of stigma. Their scars lived not only in the acts endured, but in the words they were never allowed to say. I once visited a memorial where survivors' testimonies were written on plaques. One read, "I never told anyone, not even my children." That silence became her inheritance, her scar passed down not through speech, but through absence. The truth they don't tell is that silence did not end when war did. It lingered for decades, becoming habit. Women spoke less, trusted less, laughed less. They carried silence into peace, into motherhood, into old age. Their grandchildren grew up sensing the weight of unspoken things, learning lessons from pauses heavier than sentences. The scar was generational, silence that echoed through time. I remember my grandmother in her final years. She often sat without speaking, staring into distance. When asked what she was thinking, she shook her head. I suspect she wasn't thinking at all, but remembering, trapped in the tomb inside her throat. Her scar was eternal silence, carried to her grave. The ashes in their silence remind us that survival was not just endurance of violence, but endurance of absence. Women bore this scar in their voices, their gestures, their children's training, their inability to share grief. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that silence was both shelter and prison, saving lives while burying truths. And though history records explosions and battles, it rarely records the silence that hummed beneath, heavy, suffocating, eternal. Women carry that silence still, scars invisible but deafening to those who know how to listen. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that silence was never absolute. In the cracks of silence, whispers lived, fragile threads of sound carrying warnings, secrets, prayers, and promises. Whispers became the hidden lifeline of survival, an underground current flowing beneath ruins, quiet enough to evade danger yet strong enough to keep communities alive. Women whispered instructions to their children. Don't cry now. Hide when the boots come. Wait until I call your name. These were not bedtime lullabies. They were survival codes disguised as tenderness. Whispers became the first lessons of childhood. The scar was that children learned to fear their own voices, trained to lower their breath before they even learned to sing. I remember my grandmother saying, "Our voices belong to the night." By day, silence ruled. By night, whispers traveled from one woman to another, lips brushing ears, words barely escaping throats. They whispered about bread hidden under floorboards, about soldiers spotted near the river, about safe paths through forests. Each whisper carried risk. Each word might mean salvation, or death if overheard. Her scar was the knowledge that even truth had to be smuggled in shadows. The truth they don't tell is that whispers wove invisible networks. Women carried messages across towns without paper, without pens, without proof. A whispered word in a marketplace might guide someone to safety. A whispered phrase in a hymn might signal danger. Whole communities survived on voices so fragile they could be drowned by the sound of footsteps. The scars lived in the paranoia. Who could be trusted with a whisper, and who might betray it? I once read of mothers who disguised whispers in lullabies. A change in melody meant, "Do not go outside." A repeated verse meant, "They are near." Outsiders heard only songs for children. Insiders heard survival encoded in music. Decades later, those mothers confessed they no longer remembered the original words. War had rewritten even their songs. Their scar was the loss of music, replaced forever by warning. Whispers carried guilt too. Women promised children, "Your father will come home," even when they knew he would not. They said, "Tomorrow we will eat," even when no food remained. They whispered lies out of love, but the lies became scars, remembered by children as broken promises. I remember my own mother leaning close one night, whispering stories of a better time, of gardens before fire, of bread before famine, of laughter before silence. Years later, she admitted those stories were inventions, spun from nothing so I would fall asleep. Her scar was the exhaustion of creating hope where none existed. The truth they don't tell is that whispers were dangerous evidence. A word overheard, a rumor carried, a sentence spoken to the wrong person could unravel an entire family. Women carried whispers like contraband, trading them carefully, passing them hand to hand as though they were weapons. Their scars lived in suspicion, in the constant question, who can be trusted with my voice? I once met an elderly woman who leaned close to speak, even in peace. Her voice was barely audible, a habit carved from decades of survival. When asked why, she said, "Because loud voices bring death." Her scar was permanent, her voice tethered forever to the volume of fear. The truth they don't tell is that whispers were also prayers. Women leaned over sleeping children and whispered blessings they no longer believed in. They whispered names of the dead, refusing to let them vanish. They whispered into soil as they planted seeds, asking the earth to be merciful. Their scars lived in those fragile acts of faith, in voices lowered not by devotion, but by fear. The ashes in their whispers remind us that survival is not only found in silence, but in fragile sounds hidden beneath it. Women bore this scar in their throats, in their children's training, in the words they invented to hold back despair. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that whispers carried entire worlds: survival, grief, love, deception. They were both salvation and curse. They saved lives, but they also shrank voices into shadows, leaving behind scars in generations who learned to whisper before they learned to speak. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that many carried a tomb inside their throats. Words that were never spoken, screams that were never released, confessions that never found ears, all buried, layer by layer, until the voice itself became a grave. Silence was not emptiness. Silence was weight. It pressed against the lungs, clawed at the throat, sat heavy behind the lips. It became an invisible coffin women carried with them into every stage of life. Some buried secrets of violation, too dangerous to admit. Others buried memories of children lost, knowing that speaking would reopen wounds too deep to bear. Still others buried rage, swallowing it day after day until it hardened like stone. Their throats became cemeteries where the dead were not people but words, stories, truths. The scar was not only emotional, it was physical. Women developed illnesses of the throat, of the chest, of the breath. Doctors diagnosed them with ailments of age, but these were the remnants of decades of unspoken screams. I remember my grandmother's cough. It rattled her chest in the middle of the night, long after she had stopped speaking about the war. My mother said it was from the cold winters she endured without shelter, but I sometimes wonder if it came from everything she never allowed herself to say. Her cough sounded like something trying to escape, trapped for too long. Her scar was in every rasp of her breath. Every night she could not sleep because the tomb inside her throat refused to stay quiet. The truth they don't tell is that women often carried these tombs in silence to protect others. They refused to tell their daughters what had happened, hoping to shield them from pain. They refused to tell their sons, fearing their anger or shame. They refused to tell neighbors, fearing judgment. And so the tomb grew heavier, the body bending under the weight of unspoken truths. Their scar was isolation, surrounded by people yet utterly alone inside. I once met a woman who had survived an occupation. When asked about her past, she smiled faintly and said, "Some things are better buried." But later that night, she woke up screaming, words tumbling in a language her grandchildren didn't understand. By morning, she was silent again. Her throat was a battlefield, by day a grave, by night a storm. The truth they don't tell is that silence does not erase. Silence preserves. Every memory, every violation, every hunger, every fear remains intact, buried alive inside the throat. Women carried decades of undecomposed pain embalmed in silence. Their scar was permanence, grief that never decayed, rage that never dissolved. I remember once finding a journal hidden in my grandmother's chest. It contained only fragments, a name here, a date there, a half-finished sentence. At the end of one page, she had written, "I cannot write more because if I do, I will never stop." Her pen had become her voice, but even then she censored herself. The tomb inside her throat extended into ink, into paper, into silence disguised as writing. The truth they don't tell is that the tomb shaped generations. Children sensed it without words. They grew up with mothers who avoided questions, with grandmothers who deflected memories, with elders whose eyes filled with shadows at the mention of certain dates. The silence became inheritance. The tomb passed from throat to throat, unspoken but present in every family meal, every pause in conversation, every unasked question. I once asked my mother why no one in our family ever celebrated certain holidays. She replied, "Because those were the days people disappeared. Nothing more." The tomb did not allow elaboration. Her scar was the inability to explain, leaving me to piece together fragments from silence itself. The ashes in their throats remind us that survival was not only about living through war, but about carrying cemeteries inside bodies. Women bore this scar in their coughs, their insomnia, their reluctance to speak, their broken celebrations. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that their voices became tombs. And though history remembers battles and leaders, it forgets the millions of throats that swallowed screams, the countless words buried alive. These invisible scars remain, eternal graves inside the flesh of those who survived. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that hunger was not just the absence of food. Hunger itself became another battlefield, fought not with guns but with empty stomachs, trembling hands, and the hollow ache that gnawed day after day until survival felt like betrayal. For women, hunger was both weapon and wound. It was forced upon them but also chosen, because too often they starved themselves so their children could eat. Their bodies became the currency of endurance, paying the price of survival one skipped meal at a time. Hunger changes a face. It hollows the cheeks, dulls the eyes, cracks the lips. But its deeper scar lies inside, in the way it rewires the mind, in the way it teaches a person to think of every crumb as salvation, every drop of water as wealth, every bite as betrayal if taken for oneself. Women carried that scar long after peace returned. Even decades later, many hid food under pillows, tucked bread into pockets, stored sugar in jars behind cupboards. Their kitchens became museums of fear, filled with food they never truly believed would last. I remember my grandmother telling me how she once went 4 days without eating so that her children could have something in their mouths. When asked how she managed, she said, "After a while, the hunger stops being sharp. It becomes a shadow inside you, always there, but no longer screaming." That shadow never left her. Even when she was old and frail, she would panic if the pantry looked empty. Her scar was not just physical malnutrition, but the permanent suspicion that famine was always waiting at the door. The truth they don't tell is that hunger was used as control. Armies withheld food to force obedience. Occupiers burned fields to starve communities. Women became scavengers, hunters in their own villages, searching for weeds, roots, or scraps. They turned leaves into soup, grass into flour, desperation into recipes of survival. Their scar was the humiliation of feeding their families with things not meant to be eaten, of turning hunger into an enemy they could never defeat, but only outlast. I once read about a woman who boiled leather shoes to make broth. The smell was unbearable, but it gave her children the illusion of food. When asked why she endured that shame, she replied, "Because imagination can feed longer than nothing." Her scar was the knowledge that survival sometimes demanded lies. Lies to children's stomachs. Lies to her own body. The truth they don't tell is that hunger forced impossible choices. Women divided crumbs into pieces so small they barely existed. They decided who would eat and who would wait. They fed the young while the old starved quietly in corners. They carried the guilt of these choices forever, haunted by the eyes of those who went hungry so others might live. Their scar was not just hunger itself, but the memory of choosing who would endure it more. I remember my mother saying that during one winter, her grandmother secretly gave her bread meant for her younger brother. Years later, she still cried when she spoke of it. "I stole from his hunger to quiet my own," she confessed. Her scar was guilt that never healed, though the war had ended decades before. The truth they don't tell is that hunger shaped generations. Children of war grew up hoarding food, eating quickly, distrusting abundance. Even when tables were full, they ate with urgency, as though someone might snatch the plate away. Grandchildren inherited this hunger through rituals of anxiety, saving leftovers, fearing waste, mistrusting plenty. Hunger became a legacy, a scar passed down not through genetics but through memory, embedded in family rituals. I once met a woman who admitted she could never throw food away, no matter how spoiled. "I would rather risk sickness than waste," she said. Her scar was carried into a life of peace, where every scrap still felt sacred, every morsel still felt rare. The ashes of hunger remind us that war invades not only land and body, but stomach and soul. Women bore this scar in their frail frames, in their rationing rituals, in their endless fear of scarcity. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that hunger carved them into survivors. But survival came at a price. Bodies weakened, minds reshaped, generations taught to distrust abundance. Hunger was not just a wound of the past. It was a battlefield carried forward, invisible yet eternal, carved into the very way women and their descendants learned to eat, to store, to fear. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that survival was never just about staying alive. It was also about holding on to dignity in a world determined to strip it away. When homes were burned, clothes torn, names erased, and voices silenced, what remained was the question, how does one remain human amid ruins? For women, dignity was not a luxury, it was resistance. And it came at a cost. Dignity in war looked different. It was not polished clothes or clean homes. It was washing a child's face with dirty water so he might still look cared for. It was braiding hair even when lice and ash clung to it. It was sewing patches onto rags until rags became the only uniforms of survival. Women clung to these gestures, small and fragile, because they refused to let war dictate the fullness of their humanity. Their scars lived in those gestures, because every attempt to preserve dignity was carved against a background of humiliation. I remember my grandmother folding her clothes with precision, even when she owned almost nothing. She once told me, "They can take everything, but I will not walk like a shadow." She polished her shoes with ashes when no polish remained. She washed her hands in melted snow before touching bread, even when the snow burned her skin. Her scar was the memory of keeping order in a life designed for chaos. The truth they don't tell is that dignity often cost more than hunger. Women bartered food for soap, flour for cloth, bread for combs. Outsiders judged these choices, but inside the ruins they mattered. Soap was not just soap. It was proof they were still human. A comb was not vanity. It was defiance. Clean hands, brushed hair, patched clothes. These were shields against the war's attempt to erase identity. Their scars were the accusations whispered by others. She wasted food for pride. Yet they knew the truth. Dignity fed the soul when bread could not. I once read about a woman who kept a small mirror hidden. Every morning she looked into it, not to admire beauty, but to remind herself she existed. When asked later why she risked keeping it, she answered, "Because if I forgot my face, I would not have survived." Her scar was that the mirror became both salvation and curse, reflecting strength and reminding her daily of what was lost. The truth they don't tell is that dignity was also sexual autonomy. Women endured humiliation, assault, coercion. For many, the only dignity left was silence, refusing to let their violators define them. Others resisted with subtle acts, hiding pregnancies, rejecting shame, claiming the right to raise children born from violence without allowing those children to be branded by the enemy's name. Their scars lived not just in their bodies, but in the lifelong battle to reclaim dignity from violation. I remember my mother whispering about a neighbor who dressed her daughter in boys' clothes to protect her from soldiers' eyes. That mother's scar was living every day with fear of exposure, with guilt for disguising her child. But she carried it because dignity demanded protection. The truth they don't tell is that dignity was preserved in rituals. Women buried their dead with care, even when shovels were scarce. They wrapped bodies in sheets torn from their own beds, whispered prayers through cracked lips, lit candles even if it meant going without light for themselves. To bury with dignity was to defy the war's attempt to turn death into waste. Their scars were the endless funerals, the graves dug in haste, the prayers spoken in whispers, but they clung to them because each act of dignity reclaimed humanity in a world gone savage. I once heard about a group of women who embroidered secret messages into fabric, even when the fabric would be torn apart. The act itself was not for survival, but for memory, for beauty, for proof that creation still existed amid destruction. Their scars were the endless hours spent stitching beauty into rags that would not survive, yet the act was survival itself. The ashes of dignity remind us that survival was more than breath. It was the insistence that women remain human, even when the world insisted they were less. They bore this scar in their hunger, in their rituals, in their choices. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that the price of dignity was immense. It meant sacrificing food, risking exposure, enduring judgment. It meant carrying guilt for choices outsiders could never understand. Yet without it, survival would have been hollow. Dignity was their rebellion. Dignity was their scar. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that motherhood became both blessing and curse, sanctuary and battlefield. To carry life inside a body when the world outside was determined to extinguish it was an act of rebellion and of torment. For every child born in war, there was a mother who bore scars not only from the act of giving life, but from the ashes that surrounded it. Motherhood in times of peace is already a weight. Sleepless nights, endless care, the responsibility of another fragile soul. In war, that weight multiplied until it crushed. Babies were born in barns, in forests, in cellars lit only by trembling candles. Their first cries were muffled by hands pressed gently yet desperately over their tiny mouths, not out of cruelty, but to save them from being heard. The scar of those moments lingered in women's hands for decades, hands that remembered pressing life into silence. I remember my grandmother telling me about a woman in her village who gave birth while bombs fell outside. The earth shook, dust fell from the ceiling, and still she pushed through pain. When the child finally came, her first words were not of joy, but of warning. Do not let him cry too loud. That baby survived, but the scar never left her. For the rest of her life, every time she heard her son laugh, she flinched, as though joy itself could betray them. The truth they don't tell is that many mothers had to make impossible choices. Some abandoned infants in safe houses, praying strangers would raise them. Some gave their children to neighbors with more food, more shelter, more hope. Some buried newborns in unmarked graves because there was no medicine, no warmth, no milk. Their scars were carved in these choices, scars no eye could see, but which consumed their souls. I once read about a woman who walked for days with her twins. only to realize she could carry one at a time across a river. She left one on the bank, crossed with the other, and came back to find the first gone, taken by soldiers or by death itself. Her scar was eternal. Motherhood turned into mathematics of survival. The truth they don't tell is that some women bore children born of violence. These children carried the faces of enemies, reminders of nights forced upon their mothers. And yet, many women raised them, refusing to let war define their humanity. Others could not, and their silence became another tomb. Their scars lived in their wombs, in the way they looked at their children with both love and pain, in the way they never spoke of the men who created them. I remember my mother whispering about a neighbor's child no one spoke of. He had his mother's eyes but a stranger's jawline. People in the village looked away, never asking questions. That boy grew into a man carrying a scar he never understood, while his mother carried hers in silence. The truth they don't tell is that motherhood was also starvation. Women gave away their portions, watched their bodies shrink, let their bones ache so milk would still come. Some nursed not only their own children but orphans, neighbors' babies, strangers' infants left at their doors. Their scar was the hunger carved into their own bodies, willingly endured so others might live. I remember stories of women chewing bark to trick their stomachs so that children could have the little bread left. Years later, their teeth were ruined, their stomachs scarred, their bones brittle, but they never regretted it. Their scar was a body broken by sacrifice, but also a soul unwilling to surrender motherhood to war. The truth they don't tell is that motherhood in war was both shield and chain. Children gave women reason to live when despair tempted surrender. But children also made them vulnerable, made them targets, made them prisoners of fear. Every step, every choice, every silence was dictated not by their own survival, but by the survival of the small hands clinging to theirs. Their scar was never again knowing freedom, even in peace. Because once you have carried a child through fire, you never walk alone again. The ashes of motherhood remind us that life itself was resistance. Women bore this scar in the cries they silenced, in the children they buried, in the hunger they endured, in the love they weaponized against despair. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that motherhood was forged in ashes. It was resilience carved in blood, survival written in lullabies sung through tears. And its scars remain, invisible but eternal, carried not only by the women who lived them, but by the generations that followed. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that songs vanished, carried away like smoke from burning roofs, drowned in the thunder of artillery, silenced by the fear that any sound might bring soldiers closer. Before the war, women sang everywhere, at the river while washing clothes, in fields while harvesting grain, in kitchens while kneading bread, and beside cradles as lullabies soothed restless children. Songs were threads of belonging, invisible bridges between voices, proof that life still had rhythm. But when war came, those songs were the first to die. Women learned quickly that music carried risk. A voice could betray a hiding place. A lullaby could attract attention. A hymn could be overheard and twisted into suspicion. So the melodies that once carried joy turned to ashes in their throats. They hummed less, whispered less, silenced themselves until silence itself became habit. Their scar was not just the absence of music, but the way silence replaced joy as the default sound of survival. I remember my grandmother telling me that during winters, she wanted to sing to her children to keep them calm in freezing nights, but instead, she rocked them in silence, afraid even a hum might carry through thin walls. Years later, when peace returned, her children asked why she had never sung to them. She could not answer. Her scar was guilt, the guilt of giving them safety instead of song. The truth they don't tell is that some women tried to keep songs alive by disguising them as whispers. A hymn was reduced to a murmur. A lullaby became a hum pressed into a child's ear. Even these fragile fragments carried weight, though they were stripped of melody. Yet in time, many forgot the words. Generations later, children remembered mothers' lips moving but no sound reaching them. The scar was inherited. Families whose memories of music were muted shadows, not melodies. I once read about a woman who kept a notebook of lyrics during the war. She wrote down songs from memory, terrified they would vanish forever. She never sang them, only wrote them in secret. When the war ended, she opened the notebook and realized she no longer remembered the tunes. The songs survived in words but lost their music. Her scar was that her children inherited poems where melodies should have been. The truth they don't tell is that women created new songs out of necessity, though they were not songs of joy. They sang lullabies of warning. Stay still, don't cry. They are near. They created rhythms not for celebration but for coordination, whispering chants as they carried water, as they dug graves, as they patched clothes. These songs were tools stripped of beauty. Their scar was the transformation of music into survival code. Melody turned into weapon against despair. I remember my mother telling me how, as a girl, she tried to sing to her grandmother. But her grandmother stopped her, pressing a finger to her lips. Not so loud, she whispered, though the war was long over. The scar remained, the reflex to hush joy, to suppress song, to mistrust sound. The truth they don't tell is that after war ended, songs never returned in the same way. Women sang again, yes, but their voices carried fractures. Their melodies were heavy, trembling, cracked with memory. Some refused to sing altogether, claiming their throats no longer knew how. Others sang with force, almost angrily, as though trying to drown the silence that had once ruled them. Their scars lived in those voices, songs resurrected, but never free of ghosts. I once met a choir of elderly women who had survived war. They gathered weekly to sing hymns they once knew as girls. Yet even as they sang, there was hesitation. Pauses appeared where none should exist. Lines broke where memory faltered. Tears replaced words. Their scar was visible in the way music, once effortless, now required courage. The ashes of their music remind us that war kills not only bodies but voices, not only homes but songs. Women bore this scar in their silence, in the lullabies that vanished, in the generations raised without melody. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that songs never returned as they once were. They returned fractured, hesitant, trembling, reminders of silence rather than replacements for it. And though history records battles and treaties, it rarely records the silenced music, the vanished lullabies, the stolen songs that left scars inside every woman who once sang them freely. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that their eyes never healed. Eyes became both witness and prison, recording everything, forgetting nothing, replaying scenes even decades after the dust had settled. While mouths were silenced, while hands trembled, while throats carried tombs, eyes remained open, unblinking recorders of pain. And because eyes cannot be closed forever, women carried their memories in sight, trapped by images they could never erase. War rewrites the gaze. Women who once looked at fields with hope began to see only what was missing: crops burned, animals slaughtered, homes in ashes. They looked at rivers and saw not water but bodies. They looked at roads and saw soldiers' boots instead of paths. Their eyes became haunted landscapes, carrying ruins wherever they went. Their scar was that even in peace, every sight became a memory of war. I remember my grandmother sitting by the window long after the war ended. She stared at the street below, not really watching but remembering. I once asked her what she saw. She replied, "Everything that isn't here anymore." Her eyes looked at houses rebuilt, children playing, shops open. But inside her gaze, she still saw rubble, silence, soldiers. Her scar was the double vision of survival, seeing both present and past in the same frame. The truth they don't tell is that eyes carried grief more loudly than voices ever could. Women could hide stories, could swallow words, could bury screams, but their eyes betrayed them. A glance across the table could reveal loss. A sudden shift in gaze could expose fear. Their scars lived in these betrayals, eyes that could not be trained into silence. I once met a woman who refused to look at mirrors. When asked why, she said, "Because my eyes remind me of everything I lived." Her scar was that her gaze was no longer hers. It belonged to the war, to the images burned inside it. The truth they don't tell is that children inherited these scars through their mother's eyes. Sons and daughters grew up under stares heavy with unspoken grief. They learned to read silence through glances, to measure safety in the flicker of pupils, to sense danger in widened eyes. Generations grew up mistrusting joy because their mother's eyes always carried shadows, even in moments of laughter. The scar passed silently, carried in gaze rather than in words. I remember my mother telling me how, as a child, she never believed celebrations were real. "Because my mother's eyes never smiled," she said. Even when her mouth laughed, her eyes betrayed fear. The scar was that joy felt counterfeit, fragile, easily broken. The truth they don't tell is that women's eyes became archives. They stored names, faces, disappearances. They carried the weight of remembering when others wanted to forget. Communities relied on them. Ask her, she remembers. But this remembrance was both gift and curse. To keep memory alive meant to keep wounds open. Their scars were the burden of becoming living history, eyes turned into unwilling monuments. I once read about a woman who identified bodies decades after the war by the clothes she remembered them wearing. Her eyes had cataloged everything: every neighbor, every child, every dress, every shoe. Her scar was that she could never stop cataloging, even in dreams. The ashes of memory in their eyes remind us that sight itself was wounded by war. Women bore this scar not in blindness, but in the inability to forget. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that their eyes became prisons. They carried visions that refused to fade. They betrayed secrets too heavy to speak. They passed down fear to generations. History ends battles on paper, but in women's eyes, the war never ended. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that they became the keepers of names. When graves were shallow, when records were burned, when governments erased the disappeared, it was women who carried names in whispers, in prayers, in lullabies, in the silent movement of their lips at night. Names became sacred relics, carved into silence because saying them aloud was too dangerous and too painful. A name is more than identity. It is proof that someone existed. To speak it is to resist erasure. Women understood this better than anyone because they watched husbands vanish to front lines, sons taken by soldiers, daughters swallowed by hunger. In the absence of bodies, names were all that remained. Their scars were the endless repetitions of names to themselves, so memory would not die, even if no one else remembered. I remember my grandmother sitting by the fire, her lips moving without sound. As a child, I thought she was praying. Years later, my mother told me she was reciting the names of those she lost: brothers, neighbors, friends, a litany carved into her silence. Her scar was that she could never stop repeating them, as if forgetting would mean killing them twice. The truth they don't tell is that women carved names into objects when paper was gone. They stitched initials into scraps of cloth. They etched letters into wooden spoons. They scratched them into walls of cellars. Some pressed them into soil with sticks, knowing rain would wash them away, but refusing to let them vanish unmarked. Their scars were the desperation to preserve memory in fragile matter, knowing it might not endure. I once read about a woman who braided her daughter's name into her hair with string. Each morning she tied it again, refusing to let it be erased. When soldiers cut her hair, she wept not for the loss of beauty, but for the loss of memory woven inside it. Her scar was the emptiness left in her hands, searching for strands that no longer carried her child's name. The truth they don't tell is that names became forbidden. Speaking the names of the disappeared could mean punishment, suspicion, or worse. So women whispered them only to themselves, buried them in lullabies sung under breath, or encoded them into stories that seemed harmless. They told fairy tales with characters named after their dead, hiding memory inside fables. Their scars lived in the secrecy, in the way love had to be disguised as fiction. I remember my mother telling me that her grandmother used to tell stories of a brave boy and a kind girl. Only later did she realize they were her aunt and uncle, both killed in war. The scar was that childhood tales were graves in disguise, memory smuggled through imagination. The truth they don't tell is that women carved names into silence even when no one wanted to hear. Communities, eager to rebuild, sometimes rejected reminders of loss. Don't speak of the dead, they said. But women refused. They carried names in their chests, recited them alone, inscribed them invisibly in every act of care. Their scars were the loneliness of remembering when the world chose forgetting. I once met an old woman who could no longer walk but could recite, without pause, the names of 73 people from her village who had died. Her voice trembled, her eyes burned, but she remembered each one. Her scar was that remembering was her only purpose, and it exhausted her to her final days. The ashes of their memory remind us that survival was not only about bodies that lived, but names that endured. Women bore this scar in their whispers, in their rituals, in their desperate acts of remembrance. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that they became the archives of names. Invisible books written in their hearts, invisible monuments carried in silence. History remembers battles and leaders, but it forgets the women who carried names carved into their souls, refusing to let silence erase them. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that scars became their language. Long after words were silenced, long after songs were stolen, long after whispers dissolved into the air, scars remained, etched into skin, carved into gestures, woven into habits. Scars spoke in ways women did not need to explain. They became a silent grammar of survival, a vocabulary shared across generations, a dialect written not with letters but with wounds. Some scars were visible, burns from fires that consumed homes, cuts from shattered glass, bullet grazes that brushed against skin but did not claim life. These scars were maps, drawn across bodies as reminders of where they had been, what they had endured, and what they had lost. A woman could trace her arm and remember the night she ran through flames. She could feel the raised skin on her leg and recall the forest floor where she fell, carrying a child. These marks were testimonies, unspoken yet undeniable, but most scars were invisible. They lived in the way a woman jumped at sudden noises, in the way she hoarded food, in the way she hesitated before laughing. They lived in her silence at certain dates, in her refusal to enter certain streets, in her eyes that never lingered on soldiers' uniforms. These invisible scars were harder to see, but among women they were understood. One glance could reveal everything. One hesitation could communicate entire histories. I remember my grandmother once meeting another woman who had survived the same war. They did not speak of details. They did not need to. They exchanged a look, and in that look lived recognition. I know what you carry. You know what I carry. We do not need words. Their scar was shared language, silent but deep. The truth they don't tell is that scars created community. Women who bore them sought one another, even if unconsciously. They gravitated toward those who moved with the same heaviness, who paused at the same sounds, who avoided the same places. Together, they formed networks of care without explanation, bound by scars that needed no translation. I once read about women in a displaced persons camp who created a ritual of washing each other's scars. They did not ask how each mark had been made. They simply cleaned them, dressed them, tended them. In this act, scars became conversation. One offered care, the other accepted, and no words were required. Their scar was transformed into connection. Wounds turned into bridges. The truth they don't tell is that scars also divided. Some women compared their suffering, believing theirs was heavier, theirs more real, theirs more legitimate. Some scars were judged, especially those from violations. Communities sometimes shamed women, calling them marked, stained, less. These scars became both testimony and stigma. Their language was misunderstood, twisted into judgment instead of recognition. I remember my mother telling me of a woman in her town who never showed her arms. Rumors spread of what had been done to her. People whispered, not with compassion, but with suspicion. Her scar spoke a language the community refused to hear with kindness. That was another wound. Not the act itself, but the rejection of its mark. The truth they don't tell is that scars were passed down. Daughters inherited the language even without experiencing the wounds. They grew up in homes where scars dictated behavior. The mother who never wasted food. The grandmother who never locked doors because locked doors once trapped her. The aunt who forbade laughter on certain days because laughter once betrayed hiding places. Children learned this language fluently, absorbing scars as grammar for life. Their scar was that they bore trauma without having lived it, fluent in a language of wounds they never chose to learn. I once met a young woman who said she always carried bread in her bag, though she had never known hunger. When asked why, she said, "Because my mother did, and I don't feel safe without it." That was the inheritance of scars, invisible rituals passed through generations, habits that told stories without needing to be told. The ashes of scars remind us that they are not only reminders of pain, but also tools of communication. Women bore these scars in their skin, in their silence, in their children's habits. They learned to speak without words, to share without telling, to endure without explaining. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that scars became their language. They spoke of what had been lost, of what had been endured, of what had been carried forward. They united and divided, healed and hurt, silenced and spoke. And though history writes itself in books and treaties, the true language of survival remains etched in the flesh and souls of women who lived through fire. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that when the cannon stopped and the treaties were signed, the ruins did not lift themselves. It was not generals or politicians who put stones back into walls, who cleared debris from streets, who planted the first seeds in burned fields. It was women with bare hands blistered from carrying, scarred from scraping, trembling from exhaustion. Their survival did not end with the war. Survival demanded rebuilding. And for women, rebuilding was both an act of necessity and an act of defiance. When soldiers left and silence returned to villages, women looked around and saw landscapes emptied of men. Many husbands had not come back. Many sons were buried far from home. Many fathers had vanished into prisons or mass graves. What remained were women, children, and ruins. No one asked them if they had the strength to rebuild. They simply bent down, lifted stones, and began. Their scars were inscribed in every wall they touched, every field they sowed, every roof they patched. I remember my grandmother telling me how, after the war, the women in her town gathered together, not to mourn, but to clean the streets. They carried bricks, stacked wood, mixed mortar with water from buckets. Some knew nothing of construction but learned quickly. She said, "We rebuilt with ignorance and desperation, but also with stubbornness. We wanted the world to know we were still here." Her scar was the memory of hands bleeding from cuts, yet refusing to stop. The truth they don't tell is that rebuilding required sacrifice of body and dignity. Women worked without gloves, without shoes, without proper tools. They used their shawls as ropes, their skirts as baskets, their shoulders as scaffolds. They were mothers, widows, grandmothers, suddenly turned into builders, architects, laborers. Their scars were carved into their spines, their knees, their calloused hands. I once read about women who rebuilt an entire school using only rubble. They dragged beams from collapsed houses, pieced together walls with broken stones, covered roofs with whatever tin remained. They did not wait for aid. They did not wait for governments. They built because children needed a place to learn, to laugh again. Their scar was the exhaustion of building futures while still grieving the past. The truth they don't tell is that rebuilding was not only physical. Women had to reconstruct trust in neighbors who had betrayed them, in communities fractured by suspicion. They had to rebuild rituals, festivals, prayers, songs, even when joy felt impossible. They had to teach children how to believe in tomorrow, even when tomorrow had always betrayed them. Their scars were the masks they wore, smiling while their hearts remained heavy, planting seeds in soil still soaked with blood. I remember my mother saying that after the war, her grandmother always cooked extra food, even when little was left. She invited neighbors to eat, determined to make community exist again. It was her way of rebuilding, she said. But the scar was that generosity came with fear. Fear that food would run out. Fear that someone at the table would vanish tomorrow. The truth they don't tell is that rebuilding cost women more than strength. It cost them their chance to grieve. While men's names were carved into monuments, women carried bricks. While speeches honored soldiers, women were expected to move on, to clean, to heal. Their mourning was buried beneath the labor of reconstruction. Their scar was unwept tears, grief transformed into cement that bound ruins together. I once met a woman who said, "I never cried until the walls were standing again." She rebuilt her house stone by stone, and only when the roof was whole did she collapse and weep. Her scar was the delay of grief, postponed until survival allowed space for sorrow. The ashes in their hands remind us that rebuilding is not just restoration of structures, but of meaning. Women bore this scar in their bodies, their backs bent, their hands broken, their hearts silenced while their villages rose again. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that history praises those who fought, but forgets those who rebuilt. It forgets the hands blistered from carrying, the voices hoarse from commanding, the eyes sharp from overseeing. Yet without women, ruins would have remained ruins. Their invisible scars are in every wall still standing, every field still growing, every family line that survived because they refused to stop building, even when they were broken themselves. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that the word strength was both crown and chain. History loves to call them strong. Survivors, heroines, pillars of resilience. But no one asks if they ever wanted to be. Strength was not a gift. It was not a choice. It was the only option left when everything else was stripped away. And the scars of that imposed strength never faded. To call someone strong is to forget their tears. It is to erase their exhaustion. It is to silence the fact that they too longed for protection, for softness, for collapse. Women were called strong because they carried children across mountains, because they dug graves with bare hands, because they cooked with nothing but ashes and weeds. But inside, many prayed simply to be allowed to rest. Their scar was the crushing weight of a title they never asked for. I remember my grandmother saying once, "They called me strong because I did not die, but they never asked how much of me was already dead inside." Her strength was measured in survival, but survival had hollowed her. Her scar was living decades with a reputation she could not escape. The strong woman, the one who endured, while inside, she was tired of enduring. The truth they don't tell is that strength demanded sacrifice of humanity. Women swallowed grief to appear unbreakable for their children. They silenced screams to prove calm under threat. They carried bodies when no men remained. They negotiated with soldiers, bartered dignity, endured humiliation, all in the name of survival. Their scars were not only the acts themselves, but the way they erased their own softness, their own vulnerability, until strength became mask and prison. I once read about a woman who refused to cry at her husband's funeral. She stood tall, silent, her eyes dry while others wept. Later, when asked why, she said, "Because I could not afford to fall. If I did, everything else would collapse too." Her scar was never crying again. Even in peace, her tears refused to come. The truth they don't tell is that strength often meant loneliness. Communities leaned on women, expecting them to hold everything together. But no one leaned on them. Their suffering was invisible because their strength was so visible. They carried too much, too long, without anyone asking if they needed carrying too. Their scar was isolation, standing tall in ruins, but crumbling inside. I remember my mother telling me how, after the war, her grandmother was the one everyone turned to, for advice, for shelter, for food. But when she fell ill, no one knew how to comfort her. They had forgotten she was mortal, human, fragile. Her scar was the loneliness of being everyone's strength but never anyone's burden. The truth they don't tell is that the label strong can become a chain passed down. Daughters of survivors grew up believing they too must never break, never weep, never collapse. They inherited resilience as expectation, carrying weight before they were ready. Their scars were secondhand, shaped by mothers who taught them strength, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. I once met a young woman whose grandmother survived war. She said, "In my family, weakness is betrayal. We don't cry, we endure." That was the scar of inherited strength, a lineage that mistrusted softness, confusing survival with suppression. The ashes of strength remind us that resilience is not free. It costs peace, vulnerability, rest. Women bore this scar in their bones, in their sleepless nights, in their inability to ask for help. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that the strength we admire was the weight they never chose. It was armor they were forced to wear, chains disguised as crowns. And though history praises them for it, their scars reveal the deeper truth. Strength kept them alive, but it also kept them from ever being allowed to simply live. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that history walked away without paying its debt. When the cannons fell silent, when treaties were signed, when parades celebrated victory, women stood among the ruins carrying burdens no one accounted for. Their survival was praised, their strength romanticized, their resilience admired. But the cost, the real cost, was never repaid. It was absorbed into their bodies, into their silence, into their children's inheritance. And history looked elsewhere. Nations rebuilt monuments for soldiers, carved names of generals into stone, wrote books about battles, strategies, and victories. But the women who held families together, who buried the unburied, who starved to feed others, who rebuilt villages with bare hands, their stories were left in kitchens, in lullabies, in whispers passed only to daughters. Their scars remained invisible to the archives, erased from the official price of war. I remember my grandmother looking at a monument once. It listed the names of fallen men from her village. She stood quietly, lips pressed, eyes heavy. When I asked what she was thinking, she said, "Where are our names?" We died too, but differently. Her scar was not only in what she had endured, but in being erased by the very history she helped sustain. The truth they don't tell is that women paid in ways numbers could never record. They paid with silence that suffocated them, with hunger that carved into their bones, with dignity bartered for survival, with bodies treated as battlegrounds. They paid by raising children alone, by mourning without recognition, by carrying trauma into peace. Yet no compensation came. No justice arrived. History moved forward, and women carried the debt alone. I once read about a village where women rebuilt every house after the war. Decades later, when officials came to commemorate, they spoke only of the men who had fought. Not one woman's labor was named. Not one sacrifice was acknowledged. Their scars lived not only in what they had endured, but in being forgotten afterward. The truth they don't tell is that even peace was heavy for women. When men returned, they expected to find homes, meals, families intact, not realizing these had been held together by women's blood and breath. Women were told to step back, to return to kitchens, to become silent again, as though their survival had not been war itself. Their scars deepened, not from violence, but from erasure. I remember my mother saying that her grandmother never spoke at community meetings after the war. Not because she had nothing to say, but because when she tried once, men laughed. What would she know about rebuilding? They said, forgetting she had rebuilt with her own hands. Her scar was silence imposed even after survival. The truth they don't tell is that women carried memory for the future, but no one carried memory for them. They became storytellers for grandchildren, weaving warnings into bedtime tales, turning grief into metaphors, transforming survival into quiet lessons. But their names rarely entered textbooks. Their stories rarely crossed borders. Their truths rarely reached beyond family walls. Their scars were stories too heavy for paper, too fragile for history books, too invisible for nations that preferred victories over wounds. I once met an old woman who said, "The war is over, but I am still paying for it." Her body bent, her hands twisted, her voice hoarse. She had survived, rebuilt, raised children, buried friends, yet she lived in poverty, forgotten, invisible. Her scar was not only from the past, but from the present, that refused to honor her sacrifice. The ashes of their endurance remind us that survival was not free. It cost women their bodies, their voices, their dignity, their futures. It cost them the chance to grieve, the right to rest, the freedom to be fragile. Women bore this scar in silence, while history celebrated others. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that the price of survival was never paid by nations, never recorded in treaties, never carved into stone. It was paid by women in scars invisible to the world, but eternal in their lives. And as long as those scars remain unacknowledged, history itself remains incomplete.